My name is Evelora Finch, 68 years old, born and still living in the folds of North Carolina's mountains. People in Asheville know me as the retired professor who reads poetry at the public library and still wears linen in November. I have spent a lifetime choosing my words carefully until the night I stopped. Marin, my daughter, hosted Thanksgiving that year. Her house on the hill gleamed like a showroom smell of truffle oil, polished marble, a fireplace too perfect to hold real warmth. Around her table sat friends, investors, and her husband, Grant, who liked to speak as if he owned gratitude itself. I watched them laugh through their reflections in crystal glasses. The turkey had been carved before I arrived. It didn't bother me. I'd learned where I stood in her new world somewhere between decoration and relic. "Mom," Marin said suddenly, her voice bright and hard, "you could at least thank me for organizing everything. You don't know how much I've done for you." I smiled faintly. I didn't realize love required a receipt. A few polite laughs. Grant looked down, pretending to cut his meat. Then she said it, sharp as glass. "You're so ungrateful." The word floated above the table like smoke. For a moment, I thought of all the dinners I'd skipped to pay her tuition. The nights I corrected essays to afford her first car. None of that was here. Only the silence afterward, heavy and theatrical. I stood, steady as if I'd rehearsed. I lifted my wine glass. The light caught the rim, turning it gold. "A toast," I said, my voice clear enough to still the forks. "To the last time you'll ever see me." No one moved. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to stop ticking. Marin's eyes widened shock, not remorse. I drank the wine, set the glass down gently, and walked out before anyone could find their voice. Outside, the air was colder than I expected. The lights of Asheville glimmered below the ridge, distant and small. I pulled my coat tight, opened the car door, and sat for a long time before turning the key. When the engine started, it felt like the first honest sound of the night. The road curled through the Blue Ridge like a slow, quiet question. Mist hovered low, softening the trees into gray silhouettes. I drove with the window cracked just enough to let in the smell of rain-soaked pine. My hands still trembled on the steering wheel. Not from anger anymore, but from the emptiness that follows it. Marin's voice replayed in my mind, each word rehearsed, polished with pride. I used to love that confidence. When she was little, I called it fire. She'd stand on a chair beside me, helping stir the gravy, declaring she'd take care of me one day. I'd laugh, thinking it was love. I see now it was ownership, quietly forming beneath affection. The headlights cut through a pocket of fog. For a moment, I saw the years we'd traded my lectures canceled for her school plays, my savings spent on her ambitions. None of it felt wrong then. A mother is meant to give. I just didn't know giving could become a kind of vanishing. A memory surfaced the night my husband, Dale, died. Marin was 20, angry I wouldn't sell the house to move closer to her. He'd turned to me and said softly, "Never confuse obedience with love, Evie." His hand was weak then, but his voice wasn't. Tonight, that voice felt closer than my own breath. By the time I reached the outskirts of Asheville, the fog had thickened. Streetlights glowed like distant lanterns, blurred and trembling. My Victorian house appeared at last, its windows dark, its porch sagging under wet leaves. I parked and sat a while, watching the outlines of the home Dale built with his own hands. Once, it was the measure of everything I'd done right. Now it only felt like proof of how much I'd been drained to keep it standing. Inside, the air was stale, the quiet too complete. I hung my coat on the same hook I'd used for 40 years and stared at the hollow space beside it where his used to hang. The refrigerator hummed faintly, a small, faithful sound. I leaned against the counter, eyes closed, feeling the echo of my own heartbeat fill the room. For the first time, the house didn't comfort me. It watched me. And in that stillness, I realized how far I'd already left. Morning crept in pale and quiet, filtering through lace curtains yellowed by time. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a stack of ledgers I hadn't opened in years. They still smelled faintly of ink and dust of the years I tried to keep everything balanced, even when nothing ever was. The first book was from 1998. Tuition for Marin's college semester $11,200. A note beside it in my handwriting. Paid early to avoid late fees. I flipped the page. Her first apartment deposit. Her medical bills after that ski trip accident. Her real estate licensing course. The celebratory dinner that followed. Every number neat. Every receipt tucked in with care. I waited for some trace of gratitude in the margins, maybe a thank you card, a letter, something. But all I saw was arithmetic. The ache came slow, not sharp, like a bruise you press without meaning to. I closed the ledger and rested my palms on the worn cover. I had raised my daughter to survive storms, to stand on her own. Somewhere along the way, I taught her that survival was more important than kindness. That love was measured in stability, not tenderness. Maybe she'd only followed my lesson to its bitter end. The clock ticked above the stove, steady as breath. I looked around the kitchen and saw years of quiet giving, meals reheated, bills paid, words swallowed, each act small, invisible, but heavy in accumulation. When the tears came, they surprised me not for their presence, but for how few there were left. The grief had burned too long to spill easily. I stood and reached for the phone. There was one person who would understand the practical side of heartbreak, a man who'd known both my husband and the law. Rowan Hale, retired attorney, living somewhere on the south edge of town. I hadn't spoken to him in years. As I dialed, I found my voice steady again. I wasn't calling to lament. I was calling to begin untangling what I had built with too much faith and too little caution. The envelope came 2 days later, thick and cream-colored, bearing the logo of the bank I'd trusted for 20 years. I almost mistook it for a routine statement until I saw the red line across the top. Account activity notice, immediate attention required. Inside was a printout of transactions I hadn't made. 3 withdrawals, each larger than the last, all authorized by an electronic signature that looked unsettlingly like my own. For a moment, I thought it must be a clerical error. I had never logged into that account except at the branch, never online. Still, the numbers glared back, final and cold. I called Rowan that afternoon. His voice hadn't changed, low, deliberate, touched with that mountain patience I used to rely on. When I told him what I'd received, he didn't sound surprised. "Bring the papers," he said, "and your checkbook if you still have it." His office sat in a converted craftsman bungalow near the courthouse. Shelves lined with legal texts and the faint scent of pine polish. He spread the documents under a brass lamp and studied them in silence. Then he pointed to the header. Access point, 192.648.12. Authorized user ID, Marin Freelty. My stomach turned cold. That's her company's server. He nodded once. Slow. And this isn't her first time using e-signature software. The authorization field was forged. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "So she signed your name?" He finished gently. "It's fraud, Evie. We'll file an affidavit of forgery. The account will be frozen until federal review clears it." He printed the affidavit, slid it across the desk, and handed me his pen. My name looked strange written beside the word victim when I signed. My hand didn't shake. The ache that rose wasn't confusion anymore, it was understanding. Marin and Grant hadn't just borrowed from me. They'd taken what trust remained and stamped their approval on it. Rowan folded the papers into a folder marked pending review and met my eyes. "You've been more than patient," he said. I pressed my palm flat on the desk. Steadying myself, the ink was still wet. The truth official now stamped, notarized, and irreversible. By early spring, the old Victorian stood nearly empty. I sold it to a young couple who loved its creaking floors and promised to restore it with care. I didn't tell them the house had already taken enough from me. On the morning I handed over the keys, I ran my fingers along the doorframe Dale built decades ago and whispered a quiet thank you to him, not the walls. The cottage in Brevard was nothing grand. A single-story, clapboard house nestled by the French Broad River, its porch sagging just enough to hum when the wind moved through. The first night there, I slept with the windows open and let the sound of water replace the static silence I'd lived with for too long. Days settled into a gentler rhythm. I began volunteering at the town library twice a week, helping shelve donated books and reading aloud to children on Thursdays. Their laughter filled the space where grief used to echo. On weekends, I set up a small easel by the back window and started painting again, a hobby I'd once left behind when real life became too demanding. Rowan drove down one Saturday with a box of old legal pads and a bag of apples from his garden. We sat by the riverbank while he updated me on the account investigation. His voice was calm, but his eyes held the same weight mine did, too much truth for one heart to carry lightly. "I'm not sure what peace looks like for you now," he said, skipping a pebble across the current. "Neither am I," I replied, "but I know it won't look like begging for understanding." That night, my phone blinked with 3 unheard voicemails from Marin. Her tone shifted with each one pleading, defensive, then weary. I listened for a moment, then pressed delete. The sound of the river outside was the only answer I owed her. When the light faded, I returned to my easel. On the canvas, a single lantern floated along a blue-gray current, its glow soft but steady. I dipped my brush again, tracing the reflection carefully. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something close to the shape of it. By June, the rhythm of the river had become my calendar. Its rise and fall marked the passing weeks, each one pulling me a little further from the woman who once mistook silence for peace. I spent my mornings at the small oak desk near the window, a stack of folders laid out before me, neat as confession. Rowan stopped by every Thursday, sometimes with fresh coffee, sometimes with new paperwork. Together, we pieced through the fragments bank statements, notarized affidavits, the digital logs linking Marin's firm to the transfers. Each document was heavy in its own way, but holding them gave me a steadiness that grief never had. "This part," Rowan said, sliding a folder across the desk, "establishes the trust. It'll fund housing for widowed or single women, over 60 people who've been made small by someone else's control." I nodded, signing where he pointed. "That's what I want, to make something solid out of what they tried to hollow out." He smiled faintly. "Then we'll also add a no contest clause to your will. If Marin tries to challenge it, she forfeits everything." The pen moved easily across the page. My name felt different now, less like a signature, more like a statement. When he left, I sat for a while, watching the papers fan across the desk. Years of obedience reduced to evidence. Every page, both proof and release. I opened a fresh envelope and began a letter in my slow, deliberate handwriting. "Marin, I forgive you, but I will never fund your version of love. You have your father's charm and my stubbornness. Use them to build something honest. I am not your safety net. I am your example of what not to forget." I sealed it without rereading, slipped it on top of the stack, and placed everything into the brass file Rowan had given me. I'd engraved a small plate on its front consent. The drawer shut with a soft click. Outside, the cicadas had begun their evening chorus, steady and relentless. I listened for a long time, my fingers resting on the handle, certain that the sound I heard beneath their hum was my own pulse, strong, even, unafraid. It happened on a gray afternoon, the kind of sky that felt undecided between rain and light. I was rinsing brushes by the sink when I heard the knock, urgent, uneven. Nothing like the postman's gentle tap. For a moment, I thought it might be Rowan, but when I opened the door, Marin stood there, thin and trembling, her coat soaked at the cuffs. "Mom," she said, the word brittle. I didn't know where else to go. I stepped aside, wordless. She entered cautiously, her perfume sharp against the scent of turpentine and river air. I noticed how her hands wouldn't stop moving, folding and unfolding a damp handkerchief. The nervous tick of someone holding too many lies at once. She sat at the edge of the sofa. "Grant's leaving," she blurted. "The firm's under review. They're saying things about the accounts, about the money. You have to help me." Her voice cracked on the last word. I wanted, for a second, to reach for her the way I once did when she fell from her bicycle. But the image faded as quickly as it came. "I did help you," I said quietly. "You just called it something else." She stared at me, confusion tightening into anger. "You filed those reports. You talked to that lawyer. You ruined everything. I corrected what you broke," I replied. The silence between us stretched thin. Then I crossed to the desk and took the brass file from the drawer. Inside was the envelope I'd prepared weeks ago, labeled in clean handwriting for Marin Finch. I placed it in her hands. She frowned. "What is this?" "The police report," I said, "and a copy of my will, along with a medical evaluation, in case you plan to claim I wasn't of sound mind." Her face went white. "You're unbelievable." "You called me ungrateful," I said, meeting her eyes. "You were right. I'm done being grateful for cruelty." She stood abruptly, shaking. "You're cold, Mother, stone cold." I opened the door for her, the wind catching her hair as she passed. "Cold survives fire," I murmured when she was gone. The river outside was rising from last night's rain, dark and steady, carrying everything that refused to sink. 3 weeks passed before the news reached me. I was trimming the ivy along the porch railing when Rowan's truck pulled up, the sound of gravel soft under his tires. He stepped out, holding the morning paper already folded to the business section. "They ran it," he said simply, handing it to me. Across the front page, the headline read, "Brokerage firm under investigation, alleged forged signatures and fund misappropriation." Beneath it, 2 familiar names, Grant Ellison and Marin Finch. My daughter's photograph was smaller than her husband's, but the expression on her face stopped me. Not anger, not even guilt, just exhaustion, as if she'd finally run out of places to hide. I sat back in my chair, the newspaper rustling like dry leaves. Rowan poured me tea from the pot I'd left steaming on the table. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The cicadas had begun their afternoon drone, steady as breath. "It's strange," I said finally. "There's no satisfaction in it. No victory, just the truth, standing where the lies used to be." He nodded. "You didn't destroy them, Evie. You just stopped hiding their ruins." The words settled over me, gentle and heavy all at once. I thought of Marin as a child, crouched in the garden, building towers of pebbles that always toppled when she tried to make them perfect. Maybe she'd been doing the same thing all her life, stacking false foundations, mistaking control for love. Rowan set his cup down and looked toward the river. "They'll rebuild, in some way. People like them always do. But you..." He paused, eyes softening. "You've built something they can't touch." I followed his gaze. The river moved with quiet certainty, neither hurrying nor halting for anyone's story. It had carried away every flood, every storm, without keeping a single scar. After he left, I stayed on the porch until the sun dipped low, staining the water amber. The newspaper lay folded beside me, its ink cooling in the evening breeze. I didn't need to keep it. The story was never really mine to hold. The river kept flowing, unbothered and whole, and I let its sound fill the spaces that used to ache. The first warm evening of spring arrived with the scent of lilacs drifting through the open windows. I had set the table on the porch, 4 plates. Nothing fancy, just roasted chicken, rosemary bread, and a bottle of wine Rowan brought from his cellar. Beside him sat Clara, the librarian who ran the children's reading circle, and her husband Reed, a quiet man who always spoke as if words were borrowed, not owned. We ate with the slow ease that comes when no one is performing. Laughter rose and fell like a familiar song, unforced and true. Clara teased Rowan about his handwriting on the trust documents, and he countered that lawyers were never meant to be poets. Reed told a story about getting lost on a hiking trail near Pisgah and being rescued by a raccoon, half true, half wishful. For once, I didn't listen for what was missing. I just listened. After dinner, I gathered the dishes and left them stacked by the sink. Rowan followed me to the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes on the river. The light was lowering, the kind of soft gold that forgives everything it touches. "You should paint this," he said. "I already have," I replied, nodding toward the canvas leaning near the door, the floating lantern, still unfinished but glowing faintly in the dusk. When they left, I stayed outside, lantern in hand. The glass was warm from the candle inside, its flame wavering as if aware of the moment. I walked down to the riverbank, the path lined with small white blossoms that glimmered in the fading light. The current murmured the same patient rhythm it always had, indifferent, eternal, honest. Kneeling by the water, I placed the lantern on the surface and let it go. It drifted slowly, carried by the current, a small circle of light widening across the dark. "They called me ungrateful," I said softly, the words carried by the breeze. But gratitude isn't obedience. It's peace earned the hard way. The flame flickered once, then steadied, bright even as it moved farther downstream. I stood there until it became a single dot against the horizon, swallowed by the turning of the river. When I turned back toward the house, the windows glowed with warm light. For the first time in years, it felt like home. No ghosts, no debts, no conditions, only breath, steady and free.